A routine ranger patrol turns into something else when he discovers an old bridge that should not exist and decides to go further. Watch until the end, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what you would do in his place. The patrol route had been approved weeks earlier, stamped, logged, and filed like dozens of others before it. There was nothing exceptional about it on paper. A routine high-altitude inspection of a restricted section of the park, part of the seasonal sweep that followed a cycle of storms and late snowmelt. Trails needed to be checked for erosion, warning signs for damage, and closed zones for any signs of unauthorized entry. It was the kind of work that rarely produced surprises, and that was precisely the point. Predictability kept people safe. Predictability kept the park orderly. The ranger moved steadily upward through the thinning forest, following a narrow path that clung to the slope as if it had been pressed into the mountain by decades of cautious footsteps. The air grew colder with every 100 meters of elevation, carrying the sharp scent of wet stone and pine sap. Clouds drifted low, brushing against the ridgeline and swallowing sound. Radio reception was already unreliable at this height, reduced to brief bursts of static and broken signal, something he noted without concern. It was expected. The route had been classified as low traffic and high risk, which meant solitude was part of the assignment. He had walked this section before, though never quite like this. Recent storms had rearranged the landscape in subtle ways. Fallen branches lay where none had been the previous season. Loose stones shifted underfoot, forcing him to slow his pace and test each step. He kept his eyes on the ground as much as on the surroundings, reading the terrain the way experience had taught him to do. Rock slides left patterns. Water carved new channels. Human presence, when it existed, always betrayed itself eventually. It was during one of these habitual scans that he noticed the first inconsistency. A shallow depression cut across the edge of the slope, barely visible unless one knew what to look for. It was not a trail in the official sense, not wide enough or worn enough to justify a mark on any map. Yet it bore the unmistakable signs of repeated passage. The soil was compacted in a way that rain alone could not explain. Small stones had been pushed aside and arranged almost deliberately, forming a narrow winding line through the undergrowth. Young branches had been trimmed back cleanly, not broken, and the cuts were old enough to have darkened, but not so old as to be reclaimed by moss. He paused, crouching to examine the ground more closely. The prints were faint, distorted by time and weather, but they carried a rhythm that felt intentional. Someone had moved through here more than once, carefully enough to avoid leaving obvious tracks, yet often enough to leave a pattern behind. This was not the work of a lost hiker or an impulsive trespasser. It suggested routine. The ranger straightened slowly, his hand resting near his belt out of habit rather than alarm. His training urged caution, not confrontation. There were no immediate signs of danger, no sounds beyond the wind passing through the treetops, no movement in his peripheral vision. Still, the presence of an unofficial path in a restricted zone demanded attention. He marked the location mentally, aligning it with visible landmarks, then followed it for a short distance, careful not to disturb more than necessary. The path led away from the established route, descending slightly before curving toward a steeper section of the mountain. As he advanced, the forest thinned, replaced by exposed rock and patches of stubborn vegetation clinging to the slope. The air here carried a faint metallic tang, the kind that accompanied old fixtures or long-forgotten equipment. He stopped again, listening, then continued. That was when he saw the anchor. At first it looked like a shadow cast by an irregular outcrop, but as he drew closer, its shape resolved into something unmistakably artificial. A weathered wooden post had been set deep into the rock, reinforced with metal brackets and thick bolts that had long since lost their shine. A steel cable extended from it, disappearing into the fog. The post bore no markings, no numbers, no signs of inspection tags or maintenance records. It was not something that belonged to the park's infrastructure. The ranger's pulse quickened, though his movements remained controlled. He followed the cable, stepping carefully along the narrow ledge that led to the edge of a steep drop. The fog thinned just enough for the structure to emerge from it, suspended between 2 points like a relic from another era. A bridge. It was a suspension bridge made of wooden planks and rope, reinforced in places with metal fastenings that suggested multiple phases of construction. Some boards were cracked and gray with age, others newer, their surfaces still bearing the faint sheen of recent treatment. The ropes varied in thickness and material, old hemp braided alongside modern synthetic lines. Whoever had built this had not done it all at once. They had maintained it. The bridge stretched across a deep gorge, its far end disappearing into a curtain of mist. Far below, the sound of water echoed faintly, a reminder of the height and the consequences of a misstep. The structure swayed gently in the wind, responding to forces it had been designed to endure. He stood there for a long moment, absorbing the reality of what he was seeing. Every bridge in the park, from the smallest foot crossing to the largest span, was cataloged, inspected, and assigned responsibility. This was not a matter of oversight. A structure like this could not simply be forgotten. Its absence from official records meant only one thing. It was not supposed to exist. He reached for his radio, attempting to contact the operations center, but the signal dissolved into static. He tried his phone, knowing the attempt was likely futile. There was no service. He lowered his hand, frustration giving way to focus. The protocol in such cases was clear. Unregistered structures warranted investigation, documentation, and, if necessary, closure. But protocol also demanded judgment, and judgment depended on understanding. Before committing to crossing, he inspected the bridge as thoroughly as the narrow ledge allowed. He tested the tension of the ropes, pressed his boot against several planks, listened to the creak and groan of the structure as it responded. The newer sections held firm. The older ones complained, but did not give way. This bridge was old, but it was not neglected. He secured his safety line, anchoring it to a solid point behind him, and took a cautious step onto the first plank. The bridge dipped slightly under his weight, then stabilized. He advanced slowly, distributing his weight, keeping his center low. Each step revealed more details. Fresh knots tied into older lines. Recently replaced fasteners driven into weathered wood. Someone had been here not long ago. Halfway across, the fog shifted, revealing the far side of the gorge. The tree rose from the cliff's edge like a monument, its trunk massive, scarred by time and storms, its roots gripping the rock as if refusing to be dislodged. Built into its structure was a large wooden cabin, not a crude shelter or a temporary platform, but a substantial construction with reinforced beams, wide supports, and a roof designed to shed snow and rain. A narrow walkway connected the bridge to a small landing at the cabin's entrance. This was no hideout built in haste. It was the result of planning, resources, and expertise. The ranger reached the far end of the bridge and stepped onto solid ground, unhooking his safety line with practiced efficiency. The landing showed signs of regular use. The wood was worn smooth in places, and faint marks indicated that objects had been carried across it repeatedly. There was no litter, no careless debris. Everything about the place spoke of deliberate restraint. He approached the cabin slowly, his gaze scanning for movement, listening for any sound that might suggest someone was inside. The structure loomed above him, darkened by age and exposure, its walls almost black in the dim light. The door was closed, but the hinges looked well maintained. The lock bore scratches that came not from forced entry, but from frequent use. As he stood there, one final detail caught his attention. Near the threshold, pressed into a thin layer of dried mud, was a footprint. It was not fresh enough to show sharp edges, but it was clear enough to read. The tread pattern was modern, the kind used on heavy-duty outdoor boots, not tourist footwear, not old. The ranger felt a tightening in his chest, a quiet recognition that the patrol he had begun as a routine obligation had already crossed an invisible line. Whatever this place was, it was not abandoned, and whatever story it held had not ended. He reached for the door, aware that the moment he opened it, his understanding of the park and his role within it would begin to change. The ranger did not open the door immediately. Experience had taught him that the first moments in an unfamiliar structure often revealed more than the interior itself. He remained still on the narrow landing, letting the place speak in its own way. The wind moved through the branches high above, producing a low, steady murmur. The bridge behind him creaked faintly, reacting to the changing air currents. Otherwise, there was silence. Not the hollow silence of abandonment, but the controlled quiet of a place that was meant to remain unnoticed. He examined the area around the entrance with deliberate care. There were no scattered leaves piled against the threshold, no spiderwebs claiming the corners of the frame. The wood beneath his boots was worn but clean, as if swept regularly. A small groove near the door frame showed where something heavy had been dragged across the landing more than once. The details were subtle, easily missed by someone not trained to see them, but together they formed a pattern that contradicted the idea of neglect. The lock itself confirmed it. It was not rusted, not seized by weather. A thin line of darkened oil marked the hinge points, and the metal bore the dull shine of frequent handling. Whoever used this place did not expect visitors, but they did expect to return. The ranger eased the door open slowly, applying just enough pressure to avoid a sudden sound. The hinges responded with a soft, controlled movement, more whisper than creak. Cool air flowed out from the interior, carrying the scent of wood, dried fabric, and something faintly metallic. There was no smell of mold or decay. The cabin breathed like a lived-in space. He stepped inside and paused again, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim light. The windows were small and strategically placed, designed to admit light without advertising the cabin's presence from a distance. The interior revealed itself gradually, and with it, the first undeniable truth. This was not a refuge built on impulse. It was a workspace. The room was larger than it appeared from the outside, its ceiling supported by thick beams that disappeared into the living tree itself. The walls followed the natural curve of the trunk in places, reinforced with carefully fitted planks. Everything had been constructed with efficiency in mind. There were no decorative elements, no personal clutter left carelessly behind. Each object had a purpose, and each purpose had its place. To the left, a compact cooking area stood immaculate. A small stove, cold to the touch but clean, sat beside neatly stacked firewood that had been cut and split to uniform size. A kettle rested on a hook, its surface darkened by repeated use. The shelf above held sealed containers, labeled by hand, their contents organized not by appearance but by function. Rice, dried beans, salt, powdered supplements, and energy-dense foods suitable for long-term storage. Nothing indulgent, nothing unnecessary. Opposite the cooking space, a narrow sleeping platform was built into the wall, raised just enough to avoid the chill of the floor. The bedding was folded with care, not abandoned in haste. A spare blanket lay beneath it, compressed neatly, as if it had been set aside after airing. The ranger noted the absence of dust. Someone had been here recently. Not today, perhaps not yesterday, but close enough that the cabin had not yet begun to reclaim itself. He moved deeper into the room, his boots making almost no sound on the wooden floor. Along the far wall stood a work table, and it was there that the true nature of the place revealed itself fully. Spread across the surface were notebooks, maps, and folders arranged with an order that bordered on obsessive. Nothing was stacked haphazardly. Each document lay where it could be accessed quickly, returned easily. This was the arrangement of someone who valued precision. The ranger approached the table, resisting the instinct to touch anything immediately. He studied the layout instead. The notebooks were grouped by size and wear, their covers marked with dates rather than titles. Some were thick and frayed at the edges, others newer, their bindings still firm. Maps were pinned beneath weighted objects, annotated with symbols and handwritten notes that followed no official legend, but clearly meant something to their author. A small device sat at the corner of the table, connected to a power source that ran along the wall and into the tree itself. Batteries were slotted into a charging unit, some full, some depleted, all labeled with dates of use. This was not casual preparation. It was the infrastructure of a long-term operation. The ranger picked up one of the notebooks at last, opening it carefully to avoid disturbing the pages more than necessary. The writing inside was neat and consistent, the kind that came from discipline rather than inspiration. Dates were listed first, followed by weather conditions, visibility, and brief summaries of observed activity. At first glance, the entries seemed almost mundane. Notes about distant engine sounds at night, lights moving through areas close to traffic, unidentified tracks crossing known wildlife corridors. As he turned the pages, the pattern sharpened. The observations were not random. They followed specific routes, specific times. The same areas appeared again and again, marked with increasing detail. This was not a journal of solitude, it was surveillance. He cross-referenced the notebook with one of the maps spread on the table. The symbols matched. Lines drawn in pencil traced paths through the terrain that avoided official roads and checkpoints. Small marks indicated stopping points, areas of concealment, places where the forest canopy grew dense enough to hide movement from above. Some routes ended abruptly near the gorge, while others continued far beyond the boundaries of the park. The ranger felt a subtle shift in his perception. What he had initially assumed might be the work of an eccentric recluse now bore the unmistakable signature of someone deeply familiar with both the land and the system meant to protect it. This person understood how patrols moved, how inspections were scheduled, how blind spots formed over time. He noticed the supplies next. Stacked neatly beneath the table and along the wall were boxes of equipment that told their own story. Medical kits with sealed contents and expiration dates carefully noted. Replacement filters for water purification systems. Rope, carabiners, and harnesses rated for heavy loads, some new, some worn. Each item had been maintained, replaced, and documented as needed. This was not survivalism born of fear. It was preparation born of intent. One detail stood out more than the rest. In a corner near the sleeping area, partially concealed by a hanging jacket, was a small collection of personal items. A photograph, faded at the edges, showed a younger man standing in front of a Forest Service vehicle, his arm around a colleague whose face had been scratched out deliberately. The uniform in the picture was an older design, one the ranger recognized from archived training materials. The man in the photograph wore it with familiarity. Beside the photograph lay an identification badge, its clip broken, the name partially worn away. It was official, or had been. The implications settled slowly, like sediment in water. The ranger returned his attention to the documents, moving through them with increasing care. One folder contained printed photographs taken from a distance, some blurred by low light or movement. Trucks loaded beyond legal limits, freshly cut timber stacked in areas designated as protected. Machinery bearing no visible company markings operating under the cover of night. Each photograph was dated. Each location matched an entry in the notebooks. Toward the back of the folder, the tone shifted. The notes grew shorter, sharper. Margins filled with underlined phrases and symbols repeated more urgently. Mentions of unplanned encounters, vehicles idling longer than usual, lights turning off too quickly when approached. There was no panic in the writing, but there was caution, escalating with each entry. The final pages ended abruptly. The handwriting, though still controlled, pressed harder into the paper. One entry referenced a specific route and a time window, circled twice. The next page was blank. The ranger closed the notebook slowly, the weight of what he had found settling into his awareness. This cabin was not merely a shelter. It was the center of an unofficial investigation, one conducted quietly and patiently by someone who had chosen to operate outside the system rather than within it. And that investigation had stopped without explanation. He scanned the room once more, this time looking for signs of a struggle, of a hurried departure. There were none. Nothing was overturned, nothing broken. The absence itself was unsettling. Whoever had left this place had done so deliberately or had been given no chance to resist. As he turned toward the door, preparing to step back onto the landing, his gaze fell on a final detail near the edge of the work table. A folded map lay apart from the others, its corners worn from repeated handling. On it, one location was marked more heavily than the rest, the pencil line pressed deep enough to score the paper. The ranger knew then that the bridge had not led him to an abandoned curiosity, but to the remains of a story still unfolding. Whatever had happened to the person who built this place, the work had been left unfinished. And now, whether he intended it or not, the responsibility of understanding it had passed to him. The ranger did not leave the cabin immediately. The folded map with the heavily pressed mark remained on the table, pulling at his attention like an unresolved thought. He understood that whatever he did next would shape his understanding of the place, and perhaps his own involvement in it. He closed the door behind him briefly, not to abandon the site, but to create a boundary between discovery and action. Then he returned to the work table and began, methodically, to bring order to what he had found. He started by grouping the notebooks by date, arranging them from the oldest to the most recent. The earliest entries were cautious and sparse, written in a tone that suggested exploration rather than accusation. They described sounds heard at night in areas officially closed to traffic, distant engines that did not follow any authorized route, lights appearing briefly and then vanishing behind ridgelines. At first, the observer had recorded these incidents without interpretation, as if testing whether they formed a pattern or were merely coincidences. As the ranger read on, that pattern emerged with increasing clarity. The same valleys appeared again and again, always at night, always under similar weather conditions. Fog, low cloud cover, heavy winds. Conditions that limited visibility from the air and dampened sound. The observer noted this repeatedly, underlining phrases and circling dates. It was clear that whoever had written these notes understood not just the terrain, but the rhythms of enforcement and surveillance. This was not passive observation. It was analysis. The ranger cross-referenced the notebooks with the maps. The symbols now made sense. Small triangles marked elevated observation points. Short, broken lines indicated concealed paths that branched away from known trails. Larger arrows traced routes that avoided ranger stations and patrol roads entirely. These were not guesses. They were routes tested and confirmed over time. He found the first photographs tucked into an envelope between two notebooks. They were grainy, taken from a distance with limited light, but they captured enough detail to be unmistakable. Trucks parked in clearings that should have been inaccessible. Timber stacked in irregular piles, freshly cut, the exposed wood pale against the dark forest floor. Machinery positioned beneath makeshift coverings, its shape visible only by the outline it left against the ground. Each image was labeled with coordinates and a time. The ranger felt a tightening in his jaw as he recognized some of the locations. They were areas that had been inspected and cleared in recent years, zones officially deemed stable and unthreatened. According to the records, nothing of significance had been found there. Yet the evidence in front of him told a different story, one that unfolded quietly and persistently beyond the reach of routine patrols. He continued deeper into the archive, noting how the observer's approach evolved. The early caution gave way to confidence. The notes became more detailed, more assertive. The observer no longer simply recorded what was seen, but anticipated it. Entries referenced expected movements, predicted arrivals, and estimated durations. When the predictions proved accurate, the tone sharpened further. There was a growing sense of urgency, though it remained controlled. Then came the names. They appeared first as partial references, initials scribbled in margins, license plate fragments recorded with care. Later they emerged more clearly, company names, subcontractors, logistics firms. The ranger recognized some of them immediately. They were legitimate entities, licensed to operate near the park boundaries, authorized for limited activity under strict conditions. On paper, everything about them was clean. The observer's notes suggested otherwise. One notebook contained a comparison of official permits against actual activity observed on the ground. The discrepancies were subtle but undeniable. Timber volumes exceeded reported limits. Transport schedules did not align with logged movements. Equipment appeared in protected zones without corresponding work orders. The observer had not accused anyone directly, but the implication was clear. The system was being manipulated from within. The ranger paused, leaning back slightly as he absorbed the weight of that realization. This was no longer a question of isolated violations or opportunistic trespassing. It was a coordinated operation, sustained over time, dependent on knowledge of enforcement gaps and administrative blind spots. And someone had been watching it unfold, patiently collecting proof. As he turned the pages, he noticed a shift in the observer's handwriting. The lines grew tighter, the spacing narrower, margins filled with additional notes, arrows pointing back to earlier entries, corrections made in darker ink. There were references to attempts at communication. Phrases like passed on, no response, and closed quietly appeared more than once. In one entry, the observer noted that a report had been acknowledged and then removed from the system within hours. The ranger felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. The photographs from this period were sharper, taken from closer positions. The observer had moved nearer to the activity, taking greater risks. One image showed a vehicle idling near the edge of a clearing, its headlights off, the outline of a driver visible through the windshield. Another captured a group of workers standing beside a truck, their faces indistinct, but their posture unmistakably alert, as if aware they were being watched. In the margins beside these photographs, the observer had written short, restrained comments. They noticed. Change schedule. New route. The final notebook lay apart from the others, its cover darker, more worn. The ranger hesitated before opening it, already sensing what he would find. The entries inside were fewer, each one separated by more time. The observer wrote less about the activity itself and more about the response to it. Vehicles lingering near observation points, unfamiliar faces appearing on legitimate patrol roads. Questions asked by people who did not usually ask questions. There was no fear in the writing, but there was caution sharpened to its finest edge. One entry described a meeting that never occurred. Coordinates were listed, a time noted, then crossed out and rewritten. The observer mentioned a sense of being followed, though the language remained measured, as if unwilling to grant the suspicion more weight than necessary. Another entry referenced a conversation that had ended abruptly, the details omitted entirely. The last dated page contained only a few lines. A route number circled twice. A note about weather conditions favorable for concealment. A reminder to retrieve materials afterward. The page that followed was blank. The ranger closed the notebook slowly, his fingers resting on the cover longer than necessary. He searched the cabin once more, this time with a specific question in mind. Had there been a struggle here? Had the observer been taken by force? Or had they left voluntarily, knowing the risk of staying had become too great? The answer lay in what was not present. No broken furniture, no scattered documents, no signs of a hurried departure. The observer had either left with intention or had been removed so cleanly that nothing had been disturbed. Both possibilities carried their own implications, and neither was comforting. The ranger returned to the photograph on the wall, the one showing the younger man in the outdated uniform. He studied it now with new understanding. This was not an outsider. This was someone who had once belonged to the same system. Someone who knew its strengths and its weaknesses intimately. Someone who had chosen to step away from official channels, perhaps after realizing how limited they were. That choice had come at a cost. As the ranger gathered the notebooks back into their original arrangement, he felt the boundaries of his role begin to shift. He was no longer merely documenting an anomaly in the landscape. He was standing at the intersection of an unfinished investigation and a disappearance that had been carefully erased. He folded the marked map and slipped it into his jacket, not as evidence yet, but as a reminder. The observer had mapped something specific, something important enough to emphasize above all else. Whatever lay at that location had not only drawn attention, but had likely precipitated the end of this quiet vigil. Before leaving the cabin, the ranger took one final look at the work table. The order of the materials, the precision of the notes, the patience evident in every detail all pointed to a single conclusion. This was not the work of a man driven by obsession, but by duty, a duty that had continued long after official recognition had ended. As he stepped back onto the landing and turned toward the bridge, the gorge below seemed deeper than before, its silence heavier. The ranger understood now that the bridge had carried more than footsteps across that gap. It had carried a truth that someone had tried to isolate, suspend, and ultimately erase. And by crossing it, he had stepped into that truth himself. The ranger did not leave the area immediately after stepping off the bridge. The marked map rested inside his jacket, its presence pressing against his awareness with every movement. He followed the familiar route back only part way, stopping at a rocky outcrop where the signal sometimes returned in brief, unreliable bursts. He raised the radio again, adjusted the angle of the antenna, and waited. This time, through the hiss of static, fragments of voices broke through. The message was short, clipped, and procedural. A tourist had failed to return from a registered route in the same highland sector. Search protocols were being initiated. Timestamps and coordinates followed, spoken in the neutral tone reserved for incidents that happened often enough to feel routine, yet rarely enough to carry weight. The ranger listened without interruption, committing every detail to memory. When the signal dropped again, the silence felt heavier than before. He stood still for several minutes, letting the information settle. Missing tourists were not unheard of in the park, especially in difficult terrain. Most cases resolved quickly, with hikers found disoriented, injured, or simply delayed by weather. Yet the coordinates mentioned over the radio aligned too closely with the areas marked in the observer's notes to be dismissed as coincidence. The ranger felt a tightening behind his eyes, the slow realization that two separate threads were beginning to converge. He returned to the cabin later that day, approaching it with even greater caution than before. The light had shifted, casting long shadows across the gorge, and the air carried the sharpness of approaching evening. Inside, the cabin remained unchanged, its stillness intact. He focused this time on details he had previously overlooked, looking not just for evidence of a single occupant, but for signs of others. They were there, subtle but unmistakable once noticed. A second jacket hung behind the door, lighter than the first, its fabric worn differently at the cuffs. Beneath the sleeping platform, he found a pair of boots that did not match the size or wear pattern of the others. Near the cooking area, two cups bore different marks from use, one chipped, the other intact. None of it suggested permanence, but together it indicated that this place had hosted more than one person, if only temporarily. He turned his attention back to the documents, this time searching specifically for references to outsiders. In one notebook, midway through the timeline, he found brief mentions of voices not accounted for, of lights appearing at unusual hours, of footsteps that did not follow the established patterns. The observer had not written names, only descriptions, careful and restrained. Visitors, passers through, people who did not stay long. Photographs from this period included new faces, captured only partially, silhouettes against firelight, figures blurred by motion. The observer had marked these images differently, separating them from those documenting illegal activity. These were not perpetrators. They were something else. The ranger unfolded the marked map again, tracing the emphasized route with his finger. It ran through some of the most inaccessible terrain in the region, skirting cliffs, crossing narrow ridges, and avoiding all established trails. The path made no sense for recreational travel. It was too dangerous, too deliberately concealed. But as a means of moving unseen, it was effective. He began to understand the cabin's secondary purpose. This was not only a place of observation, it was a refuge, a temporary shelter for those who needed to disappear, even briefly, people who could not afford to be seen using official routes or facilities. The supplies now made more sense. The spare clothing, the extra medical kits, the carefully maintained bridge that allowed safe passage across an otherwise impassable gorge. The missing tourist entered his thoughts again, this time with greater urgency. The ranger reviewed the details he had received earlier, comparing them to the notes in front of him. The timeline aligned closely with one of the observer's final entries. A date circled heavily, a comment about increased movement along the hidden route, a note, written smaller than the rest, that simply read, "Unexpected." He searched the cabin for any reference to that word and found it repeated once more, this time beside a crude sketch of a figure standing at the edge of a clearing, a pack slung over one shoulder. There were no labels, no explanation, just the suggestion of someone who did not belong to the pattern the observer had grown accustomed to. As dust settled outside, the ranger stepped onto the landing, scanning the surrounding forest. The light faded quickly at this altitude, turning the canopy into a mass of dark shapes. He listened, attuned now to every sound. Somewhere below, a bird took flight, startled by something unseen. The ranger waited, counting his breaths, but no further movement followed. He descended from the cabin before night fully claimed the gorge, choosing not to remain exposed. Instead of returning directly to his original route, he followed one of the concealed paths marked on the map, moving cautiously, testing each step. The trail was narrow and uneven, but clearly maintained. Stones had been shifted to create footing, branches bent just enough to allow passage without breaking. This path had been walked often. After an hour of careful descent, he reached a small clearing partially hidden by overhanging rock. The ground here was compacted, darker than the surrounding soil. He knelt, running his fingers lightly over the surface. Footprints overlapped in confusing layers, some old, some more recent. Among them were impressions that matched the boot pattern he had seen near the cabin's door. Others did not. Near the edge of the clearing, partially concealed beneath a fallen log, he found a scrap of fabric caught on a splintered branch. It was synthetic, brightly colored, the kind commonly used in lightweight hiking gear. It did not belong to the observer. It did not belong to the equipment stored in the cabin. It belonged to someone unaccustomed to moving unseen through such terrain. The ranger straightened slowly, the implications forming with unsettling clarity. If the tourist had stumbled onto this hidden network by accident, they might have seen more than they were meant to. They might have followed the wrong trail, crossed the wrong bridge, or they might have been noticed. He returned to the cabin before darkness fully set in, securing the door behind him. Inside, the space felt different now, less like an abandoned station and more like a quiet witness to events it could not record. He gathered a limited selection of materials, choosing carefully. A map copy, several photographs, notes that established timelines without revealing everything at once. He left the rest untouched, understanding that removing too much would raise questions he was not yet prepared to answer. Before leaving, he scanned the room one final time. On the work table, beneath the observer's final notebook, he noticed something he had missed earlier. A small, folded slip of paper, worn soft by handling. He opened it carefully. It contained only coordinates and a single line written in the same precise hand as the rest of the notes. If they arrive alone, send them back. The ranger closed his eyes briefly, the meaning settling heavily in his chest. The observer had anticipated accidents. They had tried to prevent them, and yet something had gone wrong. When he stepped back onto the bridge and began the crossing, the forest below seemed no longer indifferent. Every shadow suggested presence. Every sound carried intent. He understood now that the missing tourist was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, carefully concealed system that had begun to fracture. By the time he reached the far side, the ranger knew one thing with certainty. Whatever had happened here was not finished, and the deeper he went, the more likely it was that silence itself would begin to resist him. The ranger returned to the lower elevations the following morning, carrying with him the quiet weight of what he had chosen not to say. The official report he submitted was precise, restrained, and deliberately incomplete. He noted the presence of an unregistered structure in a restricted zone, described its condition, and recommended a formal review. He did not mention the archive. He did not mention the maps, the photographs, or the indications of a hidden route. He told himself this was not deception, but caution. Information once released could not be controlled, and he had already seen how easily things could be made to disappear. The response came sooner than he expected. Within hours, requests for clarification began to arrive. Not through the usual channels, not accompanied by the standard delays and procedural language. Instead, there was urgency. Coordinates were asked for directly. Access points, estimated travel time. The tone was polite, but the speed of the reaction unsettled him. Unregistered structures typically triggered weeks of paperwork before any physical follow-up occurred. This was different. By midday, he noticed the first change on the ground. A vehicle he did not recognize appeared near the service road leading toward the Highland sector. It bore no official markings, no park insignia, yet it moved with the confidence of belonging. The ranger observed it from a distance, noting its position, the way it lingered without purpose, the fact that it did not enter the restricted area, nor leave it entirely. When he later passed the same stretch of road from another direction, the vehicle was gone, leaving behind only faint tire impressions that did not match those of standard park trucks. At the station, conversations felt altered. Colleagues asked casual questions that drifted too close to specifics. How far had he gone on the route? How stable had the terrain been? Whether he had encountered anything unusual beyond the expected wear from storms. The questions were framed as professional interest, but their focus was narrow, probing the edges of what he had chosen to report. That evening, alone in his quarters, the ranger reviewed the materials he had quietly copied from the cabin. He spread them across the table, arranging them with the same discipline he had observed in the unseen observer's work. Photographs were labeled again, dates verified. Maps were annotated with his own notes, careful to distinguish his observations from those recorded before him. He created duplicates, storing them separately, understanding instinctively that a single point of failure could erase everything. He concealed one set in a location he trusted, far from the station and away from any place associated with his routine. Another he kept with him, close enough to be protected, distant enough to be abandoned if necessary. It was a compromise born not of fear, but of realism. The following day brought confirmation that his caution was warranted. He returned toward the Highlands sector under the pretense of completing a secondary inspection. As he approached the hidden approach to the bridge, he sensed immediately that something had changed. The forest felt disturbed in a way that could not be attributed to weather or wildlife. The narrow path he had followed before bore new marks, subtle but unmistakable. A stone displaced, a branch bent at a sharper angle than before. The bridge itself appeared untouched, but the landing near the cabin told a different story. The surface bore faint scuffs where none had been earlier. Inside, the cabin remained orderly, but its order had shifted. A folder lay slightly out of alignment. One of the notebooks had been returned to the shelf upside down. Small changes, easily dismissed by someone unfamiliar with the space, but glaring to anyone who had studied it closely. Something was missing. It took the Rangers several minutes to identify what it was. A single photograph, one that showed a truck with a partially visible identification number, had been removed. The rest of the archive remained intact, almost ostentatiously so, as if to signal that whoever had been here knew exactly what they were looking for and had no need to search blindly. The implication was clear. He was not the only one aware of this place, and he was not the first to return after its discovery. On his way back down, he received an official notice redirecting his duties for the remainder of the week. Temporary reassignment. Administrative necessity. The language was neutral, but the message was unmistakable. Distance, delay, containment. That night, he accessed archived reports, using credentials that still granted him limited reach. He searched for references to similar findings in past years, anomalies that might have brushed against the edges of the same issue. What he found was absence. Reports truncated mid-paragraph. References to inspections that had no corresponding outcomes. Mentions of sites that no longer appeared in later summaries. It was not proof, but it was a pattern, and patterns mattered. The final confirmation came quietly. A formal inquiry was opened into his handling of the initial report. It was framed as routine oversight, a standard review of procedure. Yet the questions focused less on safety and compliance and more on detail. Who had he spoken to? What records had he consulted? Whether he had retained any materials beyond what was required. He answered carefully, truthfully, but selectively. Each response was measured, stripped of anything that might invite deeper scrutiny. He understood now that there were forces at work within the system itself, forces invested in narrowing the scope of inquiry rather than expanding it. By the end of the week, the pressure was no longer subtle. Access permissions changed. Certain databases became unavailable. His schedule filled with tasks that kept him far from the Highlands, far from the bridge and the cabin. It was not punishment, it was insulation. The Ranger accepted the changes outwardly, performing his duties with the same professionalism he always had. Inwardly, a decision was forming, sharpened by every attempt to redirect his attention. The observer's work had not been silenced by accident. It had been contained deliberately, managed quietly until it faded from view. He would not allow that to happen again. Late one night, he gathered the remaining copies of the materials he had prepared and reviewed them one last time. He understood now that acting openly within the system would achieve nothing. Any action he took would have to be structured so that it could not be undone by a single decision or a single authority. As he extinguished the light and prepared to leave his quarters, the Ranger felt the shift complete itself. What had begun as a routine patrol had evolved into a personal obligation, one that carried risk but also clarity. The silence surrounding the bridge, the cabin, and the observer was not natural. It had been enforced, and silence, once recognized for what it was could no longer be respected. The ranger chose his moment carefully. The pressure placed upon him in the days following his initial report had not receded, but it had stabilized into something more predictable. He was no longer questioned openly, no longer redirected with obvious haste. Instead, the system behaved as if it expected him to comply with the boundaries it had quietly drawn. That expectation became his advantage. He waited until his reassigned duties brought him close enough to the perimeter of the Highland sector to justify a deviation that would not immediately raise suspicion. The route he selected aligned with one of the marked locations from the observer's maps, a point noted repeatedly but never explored in detail within the archived notes. It lay beyond official trails, reachable only by a difficult ascent that discouraged casual movement and rendered mechanical access nearly impossible under normal conditions. The climb was slow and deliberate. The ranger moved without haste, conserving energy, using the same principles he had applied throughout his career. He avoided breaking branches, chose rock over soil where possible, and paused often to listen. The terrain grew harsher as he gained elevation, the forest thinning into patches of exposed stone and scrub. Wind cut across the slope in unpredictable bursts, carrying with it the distant echo of water moving through unseen channels far below. As he approached the coordinates, the landscape began to reveal signs that matched the observer's annotations with unsettling precision. The ground bore faint impressions of repeated weight, not deep enough to draw attention at a glance, but persistent enough to compress the soil unnaturally. Vegetation had been disturbed in patterns that suggested more than foot traffic alone. This was not the aftermath of a single event. It was the residue of routine. The ranger slowed further, scanning the area ahead. The clearing itself was small, tucked against a natural rock wall that shielded it from view on three sides. From above, it would appear as nothing more than an irregular shadow. From the ground, it told a different story. The earth here was darker, compacted by pressure. Stones had been arranged to form a crude boundary, not as a marker, but as reinforcement. He crouched, examining the tracks more closely. Tire impressions, partially eroded but unmistakable, crossed the clearing at shallow angles. They were not recent, but neither were they ancient. Multiple patterns overlapped, indicating different vehicles used at different times. Some had heavier loads than others. The ranger traced one of the impressions with his fingers, feeling the compressed grit beneath the surface. Near the base of the rock wall, he found what he had been searching for. A section of the ground had been disturbed and then carefully restored. Leaves and debris had been scattered with intent rather than neglect, arranged to mimic natural fall. The ranger recognized the technique immediately. It was the kind used by people who understood how to hide work from casual inspection, but who relied on the assumption that no one would look too closely. He cleared the surface slowly, setting aside the covering layer without tearing it apart. Beneath it lay a reinforced container, sealed against moisture and partially embedded into the earth. It was not sophisticated in appearance, but it was effective. The material showed signs of wear, of repeated access and resealing. Opening it required effort. The latch resisted at first, then yielded with a dull sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the open air. Inside, the ranger found the heart of what the observer had been assembling. The documents were meticulously organized. Shipping manifests, transport schedules, weight logs, and fuel records were bundled together, protected in waterproof sleeves. Each bore official formatting, complete with stamps and signatures. Yet when compared side by side, inconsistencies emerged. Dates that did not align, volumes that exceeded permitted limits, routes that officially did not exist but appeared repeatedly across different sets of paperwork. Interspersed among the documents were digital storage devices, each labeled in the same careful handwriting the ranger had seen in the cabin. He powered one of them briefly using a portable reader, just long enough to confirm its contents. Photographs, video clips, scanned documents. Evidence layered upon evidence, forming a structure that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding or coincidence. As he worked through the materials, a narrative began to take shape. The observer had not acted alone at first. Early files suggested collaboration with another individual, possibly someone still within the system. Communication logs referenced meetings that were later canceled, exchanges that abruptly stopped. Over time, the observer's work became more isolated, the tone of the notes shifting from coordination to caution. One file, separate from the rest, drew the ranger's attention. It contained a single series of images taken from a concealed vantage point overlooking a narrow mountain route. In one frame, a figure stood apart from a group of workers, holding what appeared to be a hiking map. The person's posture was uncertain, unfamiliar with the environment. In the following image, the figure was gone. The timestamps matched the date of the tourist's disappearance. The ranger closed the container and restored the covering as best he could. Aware that he might not have another chance to return, he secured copies of the most critical materials, prioritizing those that demonstrated systemic manipulation rather than isolated wrongdoing. What he left behind was not carelessness, but strategy. If the cache was discovered again, its absence would speak loudly. As he descended from the clearing, the weight of what he had uncovered pressed against him in a way that no physical burden could match. The observer's identity, though never stated outright, had become clear enough. This was someone who had understood the rules deeply enough to see how they could be bent, and who had chosen to document that bending when others had chosen to look away. The ranger also understood now why the observer had disappeared. The work had crossed a threshold. It had moved from observation to proof, from suspicion to documentation. That transition carried consequences. By the time he reached lower ground, the ranger knew there was no path back to neutrality. The evidence he carried could not be submitted quietly, nor could it be entrusted to a single authority. The system he served was compromised not in its entirety, but in enough places to make direct confrontation ineffective. He stopped once more at a vantage point overlooking the forest, the same expanse the observer had watched for years. The wind moved through the trees with the same indifference it always had, unaware of the human calculations layered beneath its sound. The ranger made his decision there. Whatever happened next would need to unfold beyond the reach of any one office, anyone's signature. The truth would have to surface in a way that could not be folded away, delayed, or erased, and once it did, there would be no returning to the quiet certainty of routine patrols and procedural reports. As he turned away and continued down the mountain, the ranger understood that the final stage of the observer's work had begun, not in secrecy, but in preparation for exposure. The ranger understood that once he moved forward, there would be no way to return to the narrow safety of routine. The evidence he carried was no longer fragmentary or circumstantial. It was coherent, layered, and resistant to dismissal. What remained was the question of how to release it without allowing it to be contained, diluted, or quietly buried, as so much else already had been. He began by separating the materials into distinct sets, each with a purpose and a destination. One collection focused on the mechanics of the operation, shipping manifests, altered permits, mismatched volumes, and route schedules that exposed the logistical backbone of the illegal activity. Another centered on visual confirmation, photographs and video clips that captured machines where they should not have been, timber where it was forbidden, and vehicles moving through zones officially declared untouched. A third set documented the human cost, subtle but undeniable, linking the observer's disappearance and the tourist's vanishing to the same concealed corridors in moments of opportunity. He did not keep these sets together. Each was copied, encrypted where possible, and distributed across locations chosen for their independence from one another. Some were placed beyond his immediate reach, entrusted to systems that recorded access automatically and resisted alteration. Others were secured physically, hidden with the same care the observer had once used, but with one critical difference. Their existence was no longer a secret known to only one person. The ranger waited for the right catalyst. It came in the form of an external inspection notice, a routine announcement of a broader audit triggered by unrelated administrative concerns. The timing was coincidence, but the opportunity was real. External oversight brought multiple agencies into the same space, each with limited authority but overlapping jurisdiction. Where one could be pressured, another might resist. Where one might delay, another would demand explanation. The ranger submitted his materials selectively, initiating multiple inquiries at once, rather than a single centralized report. Environmental compliance units received documentation focused on protected land violations. Transport regulators were provided with evidence of falsified routes and load discrepancies. Independent oversight bodies were given access to timelines and cross-reference data that revealed systemic manipulation rather than isolated misconduct. None of the submissions accused individuals directly. They did not need to. The patterns spoke for themselves. The reaction was immediate, though not uniform. Requests for clarification multiplied. Formal notices were issued. Temporary restrictions were placed on operations pending review. The machinery of accountability, long dormant, began to turn slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Attempts were made to redirect attention, to reframe findings as procedural misunderstandings, but the breadth of the disclosures made such efforts increasingly ineffective. Pressure returned, sharper now, but it arrived too late. The ranger sensed it in the sudden urgency of communications, the careful phrasing of messages that sought cooperation while implying consequence. He complied outwardly, providing confirmations where appropriate, refusing where justified, always within the bounds of protocol. The difference lay in the fact that he was no longer the sole holder of the truth. The silence that had once protected the hidden network now worked against it. In the midst of the unfolding inquiries, he returned once more to the highlands. The bridge stood as it always had, swaying gently in the wind, indifferent to the human calculations that had passed over it. The cabin waited beyond, dark against the massive trunk of the tree, its presence unchanged by the attention gathering elsewhere. The ranger crossed slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect for what the place represented. Inside, the cabin felt different now, not abandoned, but complete. He gathered what remained of the observer's work, consolidating fragments that no longer needed to remain hidden. As he did, he noticed a final detail he had overlooked before. Tucked beneath a floorboard near the work table was a thin envelope, sealed and unmarked. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was unmistakable. The observer had written it not as a record, but as a conclusion. It contained no accusations, no instructions, only an acknowledgement of risk and a quiet certainty that the truth, once assembled fully enough, would not remain buried forever. The observer had anticipated the end of solitude, even if they had not lived to see it. The ranger replaced the envelope where he had found it. Some things did not need to be moved to be honored. As investigations progressed, fragments of information reached him through official channels. Operations were suspended. Contracts were reviewed. Personnel were reassigned pending inquiry. Public statements remained cautious, stripped of specifics, but the underlying shift was unmistakable. What had once been dismissed as impossible was now being examined in detail. The fate of the missing tourist emerged gradually, pieced together from recovered equipment and corroborated timelines. The conclusion was incomplete, unsatisfying in its lack of finality, but enough to establish that the disappearance had not been random. It had intersected fatally with a hidden system that relied on invisibility. The truth did not bring comfort, but it brought clarity. For the ranger, the consequences were quieter and more personal. His role within the park changed. He was neither praised nor condemned outright. Trust once assumed now required negotiation. Some colleagues avoided him. Others sought him out discreetly, asking careful questions, testing the boundaries of what could be spoken aloud. The landscape of his work shifted, subtly but irrevocably. On his final visit to the bridge, weeks later, the ranger paused at the midpoint, looking down into the gorge where water moved unseen beneath layers of stone and shadow. He thought of the observer, of years spent watching patiently, documenting what others chose not to see. He thought of the system that had nearly succeeded in erasing that effort through neglect and silence. The wind rose, carrying with it the familiar sounds of the forest. The bridge creaked, steady and unyielding, a reminder that structures built with care endured longer than those built to deceive. When the ranger reached the far side, he did not turn toward the cabin again. There was nothing left to discover there. The work that had begun in isolation had found its way into the open, where it could no longer be controlled by a single hand. As he walked back along the ridge, the ranger understood that justice rarely arrived with drama or resolution. More often, it emerged quietly, through persistence, through refusal to accept absence as an answer. The bridge and the cabin would one day be dismantled or reclaimed by the forest, their physical presence erased by time. The truth they had sheltered would not, and that, he knew, was enough.